have a very interesting presentation for us, but of course, we may not cover all the questions. So you take note of them and we'll return to them. So the topic will be about the current challenges in the world agricultural trade policy. And before we begin, I would like to ask, like yesterday, we will try and do a small measurement and gauging of your opinion. So there will be a small survey on the Slido in the chat. And we just want you to answer one question. Is Eugenia with us? Do you hear me? Eugenia?
Yes, Eugenia? Just a moment.
Okay, we'll come. Good.
Добре, чудово. Okay, so right. So here we go. These are the slides. And there is a link in the chat. So, dear colleagues, either through the chat link or through QR code, whichever is more convenient for you. And so before the first presentation, we have a small important question to ask of you. And that will also enable Mr. Myers to gauge your opinion a little bit. So the question, what are the main challenges do you think right now in the world agricultural policy, trade policy? So you can record your opinion and we will see the general picture afterwards. We're going to be talking about the world agricultural policy. Yesterday, we were focusing mostly on European Union. Now, though, as a wider topic, and I think it's going to be also very exciting. So logistics is the main area of challenges, right? Maybe something else? Regulations, norms and regulations, all right. Logistics, war in Ukraine, I see. Climate. So climate issues, population growth, demand, inequality of countries' developments in the world. Again, logistics, inflation, the prices for energy commodities. Also energy-related issues, food security. What else? Have I missed anything? Right, so to sum it up a little bit, the first place in the rating is logistics-related problems. Also regulatory issues, then issues related to war, food security, climate, and energy, and the regular economic issues like diversification, demand, population growth. Okay, great. So I hope Mr. Myers have heard these answers, and maybe there's also food waste related issues. Thank you. So maybe there will be a couple of words regarding this small survey. What does he think are the main challenges in the world agricultural trade policy? Thank you very much for the answers. Thank you for taking this small survey, and I pass the floor to Mr. Myers. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Dobry den to everybody there. I don't know if I can address all of the questions that you raised, but I will, let me select share my screen here. I will try to address some of them, and then hopefully I'll move fast enough that we can have some time for discussion at the end. I felt that because you have a lot of more well-informed speakers about your local situation, that I would focus more on things outside Ukraine, although obviously what's happening in Ukraine really affects the global trade policies and trade markets also. So it'll be a little bit of both, but I want to give a kind of an outline of what I'm going to cover. And like I say, I hope I can move fast enough that we can have time for discussion at the end. And I'm not sure if the organizers cut us off exactly at the time or they give us a little bit more time to talk afterwards. I know you have another speaker, so I probably cannot go over my time. Okay, so I'm going to start out talking about the global context. And I make a note that I bring one of the things I think would be useful to you, since you're all also involved in teaching and research. I'm providing the URLs, the websites for all the things that I'm using, so that you can find them later and look at them more carefully when you have more time. But I'm going to start with a little background because we've been through a period of about 20 years of a very rapid growth in trade of these commodities. The grain, I'm focusing mainly on the grains and oilseeds. And so I want to talk first about that because it will give us some perspective whether the next 10 or 20 years will be similar or different from where we have been. And then I will talk about the impacts of the Russian aggression on Ukraine, both in terms of trade effects and price effects, and also food security effects, which have been very big in the discussion and the concerns about what's going on. And then I have a section on some analytical tools that you probably use also in your teaching, and trying to apply it to some of these issues that have come up. And then at the end, discuss some of the policy recommendations that have come out from different sources. I'm mainly relying on the IFPRI, if you know about the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C., which I think has a very nice summary of policy issues. So let's start first with this graph. This graph comes from, and here's the first URL I will show you. This data is available in the USDA, what's called PS&D View, PS&D Online. And I pull it out once in a while. This one I pulled out just recently, so it's fairly up to date. It's part of, this one is actually an old one. I'll show you later on the new one. But I use this one to show two things. One is how the exports of grains, this is all grains excluding rice, and which countries they're coming from. Part of the reason for doing this is to show how important Ukraine has become in this picture. But another reason is to show that in the last 20 years, there's been tremendous growth in grain exports, but obviously tremendous growth in grain imports. So I want to dig, my colleague here has dug into the background of that. And I want to present that to you, so it also helps us to think about what might be the next 10 years look like in terms of the same issues. So so what what he did was to, Pat Westhoff, who's the director of the Food and Ag Policy Research Institute, where I've worked many years myself, and now I'm retired from that. He looked at what the sources of the growth were over this 20-year period, and combining all grains and oilseeds together. Okay, so it really covers the main crops that we usually talk about when dealing with this. And here's another URL. This is the FAPRA URL. They produce Outlook and policy analysis quite frequently. So here we go. So you all know that production comes from area and yield. So first of all, how much of this came from growth in area and how much of it came from growth in yield? Well, usually nowadays we understand that most of the potential for growth comes from yields because area expansion is relatively limited in most places around the world. And yet, during this period from about 2002 to 2020, there was about a 17% increase in area, which if you look at the little yellow box, that increase is more than the total area planted to crops in the United States, 148 million hectares compared with what we have in the US, which is a pretty big ag industry, 123 million hectares. So that the area increase was quite large, but still the yield was more important. And over the same period of time, yield increased almost 50%, about 40%, 47% if I calculate from the data that's here. So the rate of growth and yield, and this again, this is global, combined grain and oilseeds in the global scale for the whole period. Okay, so let's go to the next chart. This is the, sorry, I'm going the wrong direction. This is the global per capita use. So this is for food and feed and all uses of, it would include for oil seeds, also industrial uses like for biodiesel and corn for ethanol and so on. So it's both, it's all kinds of uses, food and industrial both. So here we have about a 20% growth in per capita, in the per capita use of grains and oilseeds over this period. And again, it was pretty flat up to about 2002. And then the last 20 years, this really rapid increase. So the issue that that he was looking at, so where did this come from? I mean, this increase, what was the source of this increase in consumption or in use of grains and oilseeds? Keep going the wrong direction. Okay, the first one, US use of corn to make ethanol. So you may know that around the year 2000, a little bit after the US started to had a policy for 10% blend of ethanol into gasoline, and this was a big, farmers supported this very much because it increases the demand for things that they produce, especially corn. And so just the use of corn to make ethanol caused a very substantial increase in grain consumption. And that flattened out because once most of the cars were using 10%, most of the fuel was already blended at 10%, there wasn't much more room for growth. Now they're talking about going up to 15% and so on, but this was a main factor in the growth. So then the next one is the growth in per capita consumption in China, where China has been very successful in terms of improving the diets of its populations. And as a part of that, of course, the per capita consumption of grains has been growing. And especially if you look at, I'm going to use my pointer here. I hope you can see my pointer. If you look at this last period, again, the last 20 years, it's increasing even faster. So the next question that Pat asked is, what happens if we take these two things out of the data? Look what we have. We have a very different picture of the per capita consumption or use of grains and oilseeds. Pretty flat, a little bit of an increase in the last couple of years because of lower prices that took place, after the high prices of the 11 and 12. But I made a circle here because I have a theory. Maybe somebody, one of you would like to look into this, but if you look at this, what is this period? This is about when the Soviet Union collapsed right here. And after that happened, because there was a lot of wasteful use of feed for livestock. And so, the rates of feeding rates were extremely high. And of course, the livestock production was very unprofitable. So there was a huge decline in feeding, in grain feeding in the former Soviet Union space. And you can look yourself at Ukraine or Russia or any of the other countries and see if this is true. But my guess is that part of this, if you took away the decline in the former Soviet Union area, you might also flatten this out in this period. That's just a hypothesis. So maybe somebody would like to look into that. Okay, now I want to look at the impacts of the Russian aggression on Ukraine, and especially on trade and prices. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of this already, and you'll probably see some more of it. But so this is going back to the picture. This is the same picture that I showed before, just to give you a starting point. This was the pre-war estimates of grain exports, excluding rice, from these different countries. Now I want to go, if I want to first go to what it looks like on a percentage basis, because it's interesting to see how the percent changed over time. Well, of course, you can see that Ukraine down here in the blue, it went from practically nothing. This is total export, so it may be slightly different than net export data, but this shows Ukraine going up to about 13–14% of global exports. Russia also increased quite a bit. Other increases were from Brazil and Argentina, were the other two areas where the share of exports increased a lot. And because of the U.S. diversion of corn into ethanol, the share in the U.S. declined quite a bit. So that explains most of this increase down here comes out of what was in the U.S. There were some changes in the shares of other countries too, but these are the big stories in this picture. Well, now what I'm showing is the most recent data. This comes from actually last week when they put out the data, and from the same source, the PSD View. And you can see two things. One is that the crop year that's just finishing up now, the 21-22 crop year, is somewhat lower, but the even bigger change is in the expected production and exports, but goes back to production ultimately, especially in Ukraine, and maybe to some extent a smaller share in Russia also. But the big change here is in Ukraine because of the war, obviously. And so that has an effect on the total side. And here is how it looks like in the shares of the total with Ukraine, Ukraine was in the last few years, Ukraine has been 11% of total exports, and now the projection for this coming year is less than 5%. Of course, as you know, there's a lot of things that we don't know how things are going to happen in the future. So this is still just a projection, but still a very drastic state of change in what's going on. Okay, oops, sorry. Sorry, I skipped over. Now you see a review of what's coming up. I hit the wrong button. Okay, where was I? Okay, now what we were chatting a little bit at the beginning of while we were waiting for the, oops, I have to go to the presentation mode here. Sorry, I messed up. To see some of the data that has come out about prices and other effects of these of the war itself, and one of them is, this is AMIS, the Agricultural Market Information System, where Ukraine is one of the participants in that, and sometimes in the past has been the chair of the group. But they have a monthly, pretty much a monthly report on prices, and you can see I put the red mark in here about where the war started and then what's happened since then. And I think we just, while we were waiting for this program to start, we were talking about prices going up and down, and I think you're well aware that recently prices have come down, but I think, you have to think about this as a very short-term thing. It can easily go back up again. Maybe they came down because people are really expecting this agreement for Ukrainian exports to play out, and hopefully it will, but that's not sure until it actually happens. So we've had a lot of volatility in prices, and maybe the price is overshot at the beginning going up, and they may be overshooting right now going down. So where it's going to end up, it's hard to say. But the one, if you look at wheat, maize, and soybeans, you can see very similar patterns, although soybeans has not come down to the extent that that the others have in recent days. But rice has not been involved. If you go back to, I'm going to talk a little bit later about the 2008 price crisis, food price crisis. In that, back in 2008, rice was one of the big movers, and all over the world it was a big factor. But rice is not a big factor in this price story. And in most countries, there is not a lot of substitution between rice and bread, or rice and wheat and maize products. So you don't have a lot of effects, cross-commodity effects going on here, as you might with some other commodities. Then if you go to FAO, you probably know you can find these pictures about price patterns that are, I'm going to try to, there we go. that the FAO puts out on a regular basis, and this is the real price of food, a food price index. And I marked these because this is the period where the indexes are usually 2014 to 2016, which is this arrow right here where this is. And this arrow is going back to the low price period. And then here, this one here, I didn't put an arrow in. This is the 2008 food price crisis. And a couple of years later, there was another one, although it was in terms of its effect on global consumption and various problems, it was not as serious as the one in 2008. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. Now, FAO also, the other thing they regularly put out are these pictures, which is the food price index. It's like that long-term one, but this is in nominal terms, and you can see how from 2019 to 2020, 21 prices have been generally going up. And then again, we have in this current year, after the war started in February, there was a surge in these prices which have come off. And this breaks it down a little bit more in terms of commodities, and you can see that there were already price increases, especially for vegetable oils, before the war started, but it just became worse afterwards. And again, it's moderating somewhat now, especially in the oilseed side, compared to what it was before. Then I want to talk a little bit about OECD. FAO have a program they put out every year, a projection of looking ahead. They do an analysis of the current situation, and also, and there's also a URL here, and their projection. And one thing to remember here, these are all expected prices, and knowing that there's a lot of variation around these prices depending on weather and lots of other uncertainties. But here we are right about now with the average price of these commodities. This is biofuels, cereals is the blue one, sweeteners, sugar mainly is the green one, and then oilseeds is in the middle here. And so our projections would also from FAPRI would also be similar, that we are expecting in general prices to moderate back again to the longer run path that they were on after this crisis is over. But it's very important for all of us who are doing these projections to make it clear that these are expected prices, and there's lots of potential for higher and lower prices depending on the events that we can't predict. I mean, for example, if there's an oil price surge, it's going to drive these prices up. If there's an oil price drop, let's say Saudi Arabia decides to pump a lot of oil out and oil prices drop, well, then we'll be in the lower part of this thing. But so around, I think for OECD and FAPRI and many other organizations that produce projections of expected levels of commodity prices, they will put a range of uncertainty around those prices. And that's what this is a 75% and a 90% uncertainty around these prices. So in the worst case, you could see prices almost as high as they are now. And in another worst case, if you're a farmer anyway, prices could even be much lower. So those are important caveats to think about when you look at these projections. But again, go to the OECD. They have a website that I'm showing here, and you can find a lot more detail about all this. The thing they did, because of the issues about whether the ports will be open or not, and whether Russia will have export restrictions or not. They did some scenarios in terms of how those possibilities or those possible outcomes would, how they would impact prices. And again, this is something that many people who do commodity analysis will be doing, just to give an indication of where effects on prices the restriction of exports might have. And because these are all hypothetical, but just to show that that's one of the factors that's bearing on the price expectations for the future. Okay, I'm going to move on to another important issue that's come up because of the Russian attack on Ukraine is the food security issue. For that, I'm going to FAO data. As you probably know, FAO produces every year an estimate of the food insecurity. The share of there's two numbers. There's a share of the population undernourished, and there's another one which is not on this picture, which is the estimates from surveys that they do. But this is the one which is the number of undernourished in the global population. And you can see that over a number of years that has been going down, and there are the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN put out, the SDGs, have a target for where this should go and over what period of time, right? Well, for many years, this has been an improving picture, but here was the food price crisis in 2008, which slowed this down a little bit. But the big problem in recent years has been COVID. So here, this is the last one. This doesn't even yet have the impact of the current food price crisis in it. This is just the effect of COVID on the what is expected by the FAO analysis to make the food insecurity much worse. And this is only 20, I put the arrow here because this is just 2020, that we don't have the 2021 figures yet. But you can just imagine that once they bring in the additional factor of the world food price crisis here, this is going to be even much worse. So, as I'm sure you well know, this has brought the global policy makers into serious discussion about what to do in order to ameliorate this problem. And this is one of the big factors, especially related to Russia and Ukraine, that many of the countries that were buying Russian and Ukrainian grain exports were in less developed or even very poor countries. And that it's easier to see it in this picture, which is a little bit bigger, which is the lower half. These are all the ones that are more than 50% dependent on blue on Russia, orange on Ukraine. This is over the recent years. So this raised serious concern among international agencies, the World Food Program and others, to deal with this because of the fact that the war was not just blocking a lot of exports from Ukraine, but also disrupting some other trade. And we'll talk a little bit about countries' policies that also had an effect on this. So one of the, if you think about how trade works in the world, obviously you can say, well, if countries can't import from one place, they could import from a different place. I mean, that's how trade is supposed to work. And this one, the solid lines show green for corn and yellow for wheat. There are no solid lines for wheat in this picture, but this is from a month or two ago. So how it was yesterday or this month, I don't know exactly. But basically the idea here is that, well, countries can buy from somewhere else. So the US is shipping to Europe and to China, and possibly Argentina and Brazil can ship to Europe, and possibly India can ship to Middle East, and so on. Well, that's how trade works. But of course, if you're in North Africa or the Middle East and you've been buying stuff from Ukraine through the Mediterranean ports or through the Black Sea ports, it's going to be a lot more expensive if you have to buy that from Argentina or Brazil, for example, or from the US. So it's not only a matter of shifting suppliers, it's a matter of both time and cost that will make a big difference. And added to this, to that problem, is the strengthening of the dollar, which for most countries will make the price of those commodities more expensive if they're using their foreign currency, obviously, to buy them. It will take more of their own currency to buy the same levels of goods. So this means that we can't just say, well, if they can't buy it from Ukraine, they can buy it from somewhere else. It's not only more expensive, more time consuming, and more of a strain on their foreign exchange resources. Okay, I now want to talk a little about analytical tools, and probably you already use these, but I might use them slightly differently than you do, and maybe we can talk about it some more later. One of them I like to use, and I think it's very handy, simplifying some of the trade issues, is to have a three-panel diagram where you have, let's say, here is the exporting country, which in this case is Ukraine, and here is the rest of the world over here. And these, the equilibrium is in the middle in the trade graph, where this excess supply from Ukraine is just the difference between these two curves, and the excess demand is the difference between the rest of the world. So you find an equilibrium here and the world price, and this is assuming that the normal transport costs involved in the trade is already embedded in these curves. So we've already taken out the transport, because I want to use these to look at policy, a couple of different policy questions. So the first one, I'm pretty sure all of you have already experienced the fact that when Ukraine's exports were stopped or slowed, the farmers are the ones that suffer the most. So what this chart shows is because the slope of this curve, or the elasticity of excess demand facing Ukraine, is larger than the elasticity of excess supply. So that means when there's I'm taking this now as the additional, this is the extra cost, is the difference between here and here. The extra cost of exporting because of the war, running all those trains to Poland and Moldova and so on, that most of that additional cost comes out of the pockets of Ukrainian farmers. And there's probably a slight influence because Ukraine is a big enough exporter that whatever happens there will influence the rest of the world prices also. But I use this to demonstrate that the biggest impact of this is on Ukrainian farmers. I'm sure if you're talking to farmers, you already know that they've suffered a lot because of this increased export cost. Okay, and then I want to talk a little bit about the other part of this, which is that because of the disruption of trade that happened and prices shot up, a number of countries have put in restrictions on their exports or otherwise taken some measures to protect their domestic market somehow or other. So Russia's an example. Russia stopped, Ukraine did for a short period of time, but then stopped doing it. But Russia was limiting its exports. Other countries, like if you remember, Indonesia stopped exporting palm oil for a while at the beginning of this crisis, but then again, they decided not to continue doing that. So from experience of the 2008 food crisis, some analysts found that the policy reaction of countries was even more severe than the original food price crisis. They just made it worse because of their actions. And the same thing happened during COVID and during the 2011 and 12 price shock. Some countries protecting their own market or taking policies which interrupted trade and made the situation worse. I'm not going to talk about the opposite side of this with imports because we're concerned now just about the export side. So in IFPRI has some great websites on this, which you can certainly go look at, and I put all the URLs here. But they have a database there where they're tracking the food export restrictions during this current crisis, and here they mark some of the places where that has happened. I'm going to go through these rather quickly, but just so you can go find them for yourself. But if you look at this yellow one in the middle, this was the tracking. This is months after the beginning. So 5 months, 10 months, 15 months. So there was a lot of interventions at the beginning, and then they kind of went off. In the COVID crisis, again, it wasn't as bad, let's say, as in the food price crisis of 2008, and it went away faster. And now the question is, here is the current one. They draw this line and says, maybe, we don't know, but there's a later one I'll show you in a minute, which if you go to their website, you can see as they update these data. But this is one of the problems, one of the concerns, that when countries interfere like this, it just makes the price situation even worse. And then they have a chart about how many of these are export licensing, how many of these are export bans. And here's a more recurrent, a little bit busier chart, but same sort of a thing. This is the share of global trade that is impacted by these things. Now, again, this orange one is from the orange one is from the food price crisis of 2008. It would appear now that this is the current price situation, that it's probably getting a little bit better than it was during the 2008 price crisis in terms of this effect. And again, here's the COVID one. And the same sort of chart is the number of countries implement. So here's the share of global trade, which is probably more important. And here's the number of countries the same way. So it's a little bit better off, it appears, than it was during the food price crisis of 2007-8. And then they have charts that show, this is just a little picture from the chart, but they have all the countries in here. As I mentioned, Ukraine had, you probably know better than me, there was an interruption at the beginning, being concerned about providing domestic markets for sufficient food and so on, but that was taken away pretty soon. Turkey still has policies, and what they do, they say they assume that if the measures have not stopped, they just let them go till the end of the year. So in the case of Russia, the export licensing stopped, but the ban did not, and so on. And Serbia has one, and Turkey has one, and so on. So those are just indicators of what's interrupting. And so out of this analysis, they have, they have they've calculated the share of calories that are impacted by these export restrictions. And the current crisis in terms of the prices is practically the same as it was in the food price crisis. I mean, there's a little difference in the percentages, 26, 29, 21, 20, and so on. Both of them are bigger than the COVID one, but these are all pretty significant, and it helps to explain why the international agencies are so concerned about this situation and trying to do something to address, like the agreement to hopefully open the ports of Ukraine and let exports flow again. And also providing more financial resources for countries to pay for higher costs of imports and so on. So all of those are responses to these issues, but also there's policy advice to these countries to stop impeding the normal flow of trade. Now, a few more of these pictures. This is now more generally exporter, I think, again, you're familiar with this, but this is just to show, again, why an export restriction, in this case, we can think of this as a quota. Instead of exporting this much, the country says, oh, we need to keep some of this for ourselves. And as a result of that, they would lower the price and keep the price lower on the internal market, but then it imposes a higher price on the rest of the world. And in the extreme case, this, by the way, this could be either export tax equal to this difference, or it could be an export quota equal to this quantity here. There's a little bit of difference in terms of stochastic effects, but in terms of the price effects, either one of those would, if it was at the same place, would have a similar impact on prices of the domestic market and the export market. And then we have the case of if a country completely eliminates its exports, of course, it just makes those price effects lower in the home country and higher in the rest of the world. So those are just using those. I throw this up here because if you're doing this kind of stuff in your teaching, this is a very good source. They draw their graphs a little bit differently. I prefer the 3-panel diagrams to the 2-panel ones, but this also has the consumer and producer welfare effects, which you can work out. But the one nice thing about this publication is that they have a number of different chapters dealing with different kinds of trade policies that you might find to be useful. Right here, I'm just showing one that has a impact on the same issue that we're talking about. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit finally about policy recommendations. And again, I rely a lot on the IFPRI publications for looking at this. So, oops, I did that again. Shoot, sorry, I was, I hit the wrong button I go to the end instead of to the next slide. So if we put out a analysis of what WTO should do, and that was, you know, if you remember back to the Uruguay round agreement of the GATT, which led to the policies in the mid-90s and pretty much still in place today. There were a lot of restrictions put on exporters, you know, not subsidizing exports and how much you could do of this or that. But they never were able to do much substantially about restricting countries from blocking its own exports. In other words, they seem to be, the WTO seemed to be reluctant to make countries, let's say, abide by some international rules about limiting exports. So in the IFPRI proposal, the first one is to exempt humanitarian shipments from any quantitative export restrictions or taxes, either one of those. They've been trying, I mean, other agencies like IFPRI and others have been trying for many years to get WTO to agree to such a thing. I will show you later that there actually was a little bit of progress on that. Then they also, on this, the second point here was to improve the notification to have countries, because when you probably know that when countries impose tariffs and things to protect a country from imports, they have to notify the WTO about that. Well, what they want to say here is that they should be notification also for export restrictions that countries make. And as they say here, IFPRI is doing that, but this is not. This is kind of sort of unofficial because it's not the WTO doing it. So anyway, those are two things that they proposed, and then they had three other things that were on their list of what to do, and one was to exempt less developed countries and insular economics from export bans and restrictions, to just, you know, say they should not be impacted by such policies. And then the fourth one is to restrict the use of Article 9, which is kind of it's a place in the WTO agreement that allows countries to sort of bypass some of the regulations. So anyway, these three things are in IFPRI's call for action, and at least one of those things seems to have happened in the recent WTO ministerial number 12, which is, as you may know, after the Uruguay-Iran agreement, which was so many years ago, about 95. In the last almost couple of decades, they've been working on the Doha round and making very slow progress on anything. But anyway, they have these ministerial meetings to try to get something done, and once in a while they'll accomplish something. And they did. If you look at number 2, it does say that members should not impose export prohibitions or restrictions on foodstuff for non-commercial humanitarian purposes by the World Food Program. So at least they're saying that they've agreed that this should not be imposed on humanitarian products, foods, and so on. The problem is, if you look at number 2, it seems to give them, it says, oh, well, if you're doing something to protect your domestic food security, then maybe you can get out of this. So there is, I would say that's why I call this a weak agreement, but it's probably could be seen as some kind of progress along the lines that IFPRI was suggesting. And then this is finally the summary of some of IFPRI's suggestions on the do's and don'ts. They suggest that countries like the US, and I guess you could say the same for the EU, remove the subsidies or mandates that are used for biofuels. To my knowledge, no one has actually done that. Second one, target social safety nets to most needy. I think that has certainly been done in most of the food price crises, including this one. Although it's probably never enough. Boost funding to World Food Program and other humanitarian, I think that has happened for sure. WFP has been very active in trying to deal with global food security issues, and especially in response to this current crisis. So that's probably, you could say that. And then the fourth one here is really gets back to this issue about the interventions. Allow market prices to guide producer and consumer decisions. So that is to say, don't interfere or interrupt the normal operation of trade. And then they have the list of don'ts, which is about sanctions, which is about export restrictions, panic buying, which is, on the import side, countries always say, oh, we better hurry up and buy some stuff. The Philippines did this in 2008. They went and bought a lot of rice, and it turned out it wasn't really necessary, but it was really a panic response. Not to mention that a lot of households were going out and buying a lot of rice too, that, are rice eating households. So all of that sort of panic buying, is just makes the price increases more severe. Don't try to target subsidies to engineer production outcomes. Some people were saying the U.S., for example, should give wheat farmers more support in order that they would go out and plant more wheat next year. Although so they say don't do that. Don't cancel environmental incentives, because that would just create another harmful effect of reducing environmental policy impacts. And don't promote self-sufficiency and autarky strategies. So these are, it's a pretty good list of do's and don'ts for the international market that IFPRI came up with. And then here, I just said end, I have the list of the URLs that I think I got all of them here, but if you want, you can also look through to see if I missed any that were in the slides that are not on this list. So with that, I'm going to stop my discussion and let you throw out the questions that you may have, and let's see, I will get out of this. I will stop sharing for one thing, and then we can go back to the
Дуже дякуємо вам.
Right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Myers. It was very comprehensive, very interesting. Indeed, when we advocated this program for the school, we wanted to see a multi-sided view on these problems, that what's happening in the world related to Ukraine, and of course, looking out into what's happening in the EU. You have to look globally. So I'm very thankful to Mr. Myers for giving us quite a wide look in the global context, and also bringing very useful examples, very useful information, especially those links and URLs that were in the presentation. They will be of very much use to you. It's a very interesting material for your preparation of your publications, your speeches. So we have several questions. So let's start with them. First was Madam Sokolska. She had two questions, even three, sorry. What the state has to do in order to improve its position on the world food market? I mean, it's a general question, right? So, or Ukrainian context. So both ways.
You mean the Ukrainian state? Are you talking about the Ukrainian state or any state?
Давайте спробуємо відповісти з точки зору України, бо все ж таки український підхід.
Let's take Ukrainian state, because Ukrainian approach is the most pertinent for us.
Yeah. Well, of course, one of the difficulties right now is that I'm sure, like, for example, Ukraine would love to export a lot more grain and oilseeds, but can't because of the Russian war. So I think if I can go back in history, a little bit, Ukraine did have export taxes, export restrictions back in it, but they did away with those. So that was really an improvement of Ukrainian export policy. It really helped farmers because it allowed higher prices to pass through to the farmers in Ukraine. And you saw in the one of the pictures that I showed that at the beginning of this current crisis, Ukraine did have, you probably know better than me what that was, but it looks like for a little while they began to protect the domestic market for some of these food products, but then decided not to do that, which means that they were making the decision to remain open and in a sense followed the recommendations of IFPRI. But so I think that Ukraine has had a pretty good policy in terms of supporting exports in the export industry, if only because of the war it has been disrupted, and I would say despite the war, there's been extremely valiant efforts, at least from what I have seen over here, the Ukraine has been taking to get grain moving, even though it's been very difficult and very costly. And as I mentioned, because of the higher costs, it has damaged farmers' incomes. Now, that's probably one of the things that is considered or should be considered would be to compensate farmers for those price effects that they have because of this higher cost of moving grain out of the country. Is not the farmer's fault, obviously. So some compensation to farmers for those losses is something that should also or could also be considered as a policy.
Дуже дякую.
Thank you so much. Next question. Do you support export limitations for several countries for precisely the crisis time, temporary?
No, I would not. I mean, I think I agree with IFPRI's recommendations here that countries, you know, mostly of the time, that's a response to sort of try to protect the domestic, if it's an exporting country. If they're limiting exports, they're trying to protect the domestic market. Oh, let's be sure that we have enough and don't let our prices go up very much. The world prices are going up and we want our prices not to go up like that. So that just disrupts the international trading system and makes matters worse. So you can imagine that, and I think this is more like what happened in 2008 food price crisis. It wasn't a war. It was just that there was a bad harvest in a lot of places, and prices went up. And then if countries had just let things alone and let things work out, it wouldn't have been so bad. But because I mentioned the Philippines panicked and bought a lot of rice. Well, they just made the prices go up even more. So that kind of reaction is not helpful at all. It just makes the problem worse. And so I think in this is the reason for IFPRI's proposal or recommendation that countries do not, you know, jump in and interfere with the flow, because they're just exacerbating or making the price shock even worse than it was before.
Thank you. And the third question, can leading countries in the world avoid dependence from Russian energy resources, energy commodities? Can they avoid it somehow? And if so, what they should do first and foremost?
Well, yeah, that would certainly be advantageous, and of course you can see that many of them are trying to do that. It's just that it's a little bit late. You have I mean, the good examples for this are the Baltic states, which have shifted over to LNG, liquid natural gas, and weaned themselves away from the Russian sources. Those are smaller countries, so it's easier than for Germany. But Germany, for example, is decommissioning their nuclear power plants, which to me it doesn't make any sense. Nuclear power is not a polluting industry. It's pretty safe from what I understand. And by doing away with, I mean, actually they're still there. If they could reopen them, that might be something they could consider doing. But by decommissioning those nuclear power plants, they've made themselves more dependent on Russia, and it's harder. They can get away from it, but it takes time, it just seems like they made their problem much worse, or they didn't anticipate that this would be a problem back when they decided to decommission nuclear power plants. Of course, you know that France is a high level of dependence on nuclear power, and they're doing fine. I mean, they're in a much better situation because of that. And in the same way, in the US, there is a lot of suggestions of people that we should also do that. We got scared by the by the accident of a nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania like 20, 30 years ago. I don't remember anymore how long it was. But nowadays, those plants are relatively safe, and they're much more environmentally friendly than most of the alternatives like coal and fossil fuels. So yeah, I think countries should do it. It's just that past decisions have limited their options or make it more difficult to do that in a rapid way.
Дякую.
Thank you. Thank you for this comment. And I would also offer or read a comment from chat. Mr. Solomonko writes, resolving the problem of the current problem of rapid price dynamics for the main groups of food depends on well-coordinated action of the G20, or at least a G18 of this G20. Thank you for this comment. Well, I would like to address Mr. Kalyachenko. He raised his hand. Please, you have a question? Fire away. Please turn on your microphone. Okay. So we see the trend that Ukraine can grow over 60 different crops, agricultural crops. This is a unique opportunity, but we have become so much part of the food safety of other countries because we focused on several basic seed commodities, and that makes us lose colossal profits through potential other crops. And that's why we have like animal husbandry, horticulture, and other agricultural sub-industries have been cut down. We lose billions because of that. So we've become like a cog, a necessary cog for food safety of other countries. And that holds us in that template and that mindset. So we pay the biggest price for that, unfortunately, right now. And if you look at this dynamic in history, we can see that. It goes in cycles in economics and history. So what do you think? Could Ukraine stop paying this high price for food safety of other countries on its own resource? Thank you.
Yeah, I look at that maybe a little bit differently, but I've always, or I said for a long time, thought that if you look at another place that has the kind of land resources that Ukraine has, Iowa. I used to live in Iowa for a long time. Iowa has a lot of livestock, and it always surprised me that Ukraine, I understand because of the collapse of the Soviet Union and all the things that happened after that. But as far as I know, only the poultry industry has prospered in Ukraine. But I don't see why you couldn't have a very dynamic hog industry, for example, because as you say, that grain would be much more valuable for the economy of Ukraine if it was fed to livestock, and then you're consuming, or you're either reducing imports of those livestock products, or you're actually exporting meat instead of grain. So I'm not quite sure why that hasn't happened yet, or why it seems to happen in the poultry, but it hasn't happened yet for hogs or dairy or cattle. But I think that's the future of Ukraine, really, that if it evolves in the way that we would see here in the Midwest. Here I'm in Arizona. I'm not in the Midwest today, but where I live, the value for agriculture certainly is greater if you can use those grains domestically, or you can do both. But the thing is, I agree with you that there's a lot more potential for Ukraine to develop its livestock industry, to get higher value to those to the crops that you grow. It wouldn't mean that you don't export anything, but maybe you'd export less and feed more domestically. I hope that that will be the future of Ukrainian agriculture. It seems like the natural way it would go. You know, if you think about the resources that that Ukraine has.
Дуже дякую. Наступне запитання.
Thanks a lot. Next question. We have several questions. Hopefully we'll have enough time. So it's a question from Madam Novak. Are American producers ready to compensate the lack of Ukrainian grains that the Russians steal? Or if Ukrainian ports are not open, can the US avoid, and the world, can they avoid the food crisis? Can every citizens pay for that? Are they ready to pay the price for this?
Yeah, that's difficult. I mean, I think the best way is to get those grains out, and I know that a lot of different agencies and people are working on solving this problem. I'm actually, I think it's pretty impressive that Ukraine has found ways to do as much as it has getting the grain out in spite of the terrible consequences of the Russian war. But of course there are limits because of you know, the moving things across the land is so much slower. I'm sure the quantity that you can move is much less. So yes, the most important thing is to open is to open the way for the Ukraine to export what's not even considering what's being produced now or harvested this year, what was already in storage from before. But unfortunately, you know, it all depends on on whether those who agreed to this deal to allow shipment will abide by their agreement. Right now, I feel like I'm not sure it's going to happen, but I hope it will. I think other countries are limited in what they can do. Of course, you know, I don't think, you know, for example, it's going to, if prices are higher, farmers will respond by producing more. But right now, the price signals are a little bit mixed. I think because they've jumped up and now they've come back down again, and they might go back up again. But I think we also have problems this year, as you may know, that we have a severe drought in some areas, a very poor wheat crop, and other parts of the world also had some problems. So you could see in that picture that I showed the at least the projected production for the coming, this year is lower than it was before, and for next year it's actually going down a little bit from what is expected for this year. And it's not only Ukraine that's going down, that was the biggest decline, but some other places as well because of climate or weather conditions. So I think there's always the problem of distribution of available grains and food around the world says was with us before, and it will be with us after this because of the food insecurity and the other problems that cause purchasing power and distribution systems to be inadequate. But this, when we have a crisis like this, when prices go up and trade is disrupted, it just makes it harder to deal with. And I think countries, the US and European countries and others have responded by giving more resources to the World Food Program, which is the one that knows how to move things around the world to where it's needed for emergency purposes. But the regular trade processes have to continue also. And that's why I keep going back to this recommendation from IFPRI that countries should not make things worse by blocking exports and taxing exports and doing things like that. Let the markets work and help them out, maybe by giving more resources or more income to poor people to buy the goods or more assistance to WFP to help move food to countries that need it the most.
Дякую за ваш коментар до цього.
Thank you for the comment. Let's try to squeeze in a couple more questions, very short ones. Next question from Madam Batajok. What would you suggest to do? What ways to protect the domestic market of Ukraine to avoid the hunger, famine in 2023? Because many politicians and economists, they forecast the possible famine in Ukraine. Over.
Well, yeah, I haven't seen that. I mean, I think the best way to avoid that, first of all, is to be sure that people have purchasing power, because a lot of times, well, it's hard for me to imagine a famine in Ukraine, but I can imagine people who have, because of poverty or because of they're dislocated and their normal lives have been disrupted by the war, they don't have the resources that they would normally have, and therefore they need cash in their pocket somehow to buy food. So I think the main response I would have to that situation is to have programs, what we call safety net programs, that when for whatever reason people are dispossessed of their income or their ability to produce, that there is a resource, a safety net funded by the government, and now you would have to ask the international community for resources to do that, to provide that funding. Safety net so that people don't fall through the cracks. If they can't produce, they have to buy, or if they can't work and they need funds to buy. So this is the big safety net issue, and I think it's a common way that excuse me, that countries can deal with parts of the society that, for either temporary, especially in temporary situations like this, they can get.
Дякую, бачу також коментар.
All right, thank you. I also see a comment regarding there will be no famine in Ukraine, but other countries that are depending on Ukrainian exports, if they won't reorient for some time after war, there may be some things like resemble famine. Thank you for the comment. But last question. How the war and the food situation can impact food security and possible famine in the countries who depended on their current exports before the war, or from Ukrainian exports before the war. So we talked about this, but summing up, a couple of words, other countries, how can they avoid famine because of the Ukrainian crisis and the food crisis?
Yes, well, I think I did show, or many people have shown how much certain countries in Africa and the Middle East especially have depended on Ukraine specifically as a source of and in Russia too, source of food, grains especially, but and maybe oilseeds. Yes, I think this is where WFP comes in. I mean, because they are a fantastic logistical high tech program that knows how to move stuff around. I mean, they go from airplanes to camelbacks. I mean, to get things out to the places that need it. They need more money, and hopefully they're getting more money from the G20 to address these issues around the world. And I think that's going to be the main source of solving this short-term, what I would hope would be short-term problems.
Right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayers. Thank you, dear participants, for your questions. A good job doing so. And we will be able to continue discussion in different areas. Thank you, Mr. Myers, for your responses, for an interesting presentation. And of course, hopefully in the nearest future, we'll see you again in Ukraine.
Yes,
if possible.
I hope so. I hope so. Добро бачення.
Дякую. А ми рухаємося далі і зараз спробуємо трошки переключитися.
Thank you. And we're moving forward.
Переключитися. Зараз у нас знову з'явиться в чаті така собі силочка. Посиланнячко на наступні декілька запитань, для того, щоб наш наступний спікер зміг знову зорієнтуватися.
We posted several questions in the chat, so the next speaker can orient themselves regarding the next topic.
Це посилання зараз отримаємо. А наступна тема, якою ми будемо займатися.
And the next topic we're dealing with is going to be climate and trade barriers as a test of resilience and sustainability of agricultural production. After we talked about the challenges and prospects and problems that we face in Ukraine, that the EU is confronting, we can see what else can we face.
Можемо дещо упустити. От для того, щоб цього не упустити, треба бути проінформованим. Тож я бачу, з'явилася
So we have to be informed.
З'явився в нас і QR-код.
We have the link, we have the QR code. You know how to use it.
Переходимо до нашого першого запитання. І наше перше запитання тут стосується наступного. Які критичні наслідки зміни клімату вам вважаються найбільш вагомими для аграрного виробництва в майбутньому? Тут ми навели, так скажімо, рандомно декілька причин, але сподіваємося почути на це вашу думку. Я думаю, це не єдині наслідки, але тим не менше. У нас була нестача ґрунтової вологи або опадів, несприятливі температурні умови, деградація ґрунтів, екстремальні кліматичні явища, зростання цін на виробництво, а також певні обмеження торгівлі. Ну, бачу, що поки що лідирує в нас питання з водою. Я думаю, що питання з водою, воно всім найбільш таке знайоме, близьке, як то кажуть, якщо можна так сказати, але тим не менш. Добре, тож нестача води в нас на першому місці, далі деградація ґрунтів, несприятливі температурні умови, ну і екстремальні кліматичні явища. Ніхто не побачив поки що обмеження торгівлі. Добре, дякую. Наше наступне запитання тоді до вас, воно звучить наступним чином. З чим у вас асоціюється поняття кліматичних торговельних бар'єрів? От наша наступна тема – це кліматичні торговельні бар'єри. Тут, будь ласка, у вас є можливість надати ваше бачення, вашу власну думку одним словом, кількома словами. Будь ласка, ваші ідеї. Що вперше спадає на думку, коли ми говоримо про кліматичні торговельні бар'єри? Розуміємо, можливо, для когось там торгівля – це десь з одного боку, там клімат з іншого боку, бар'єри десь посередині, але тим не менше, якщо збирати от разом це поняття, про що ви замислюєтесь? Ага, бар'єри захисту навколишнього середовища, окей. Які є ще ідеї? Якість ґрунтів, ускладнення транспортування продукції. Ага, добре, дякую. Викиди з'явились, так, низька врожайність, погана якість продукції, нестабільність, неможливість вирощування окремих культур, протекціонізм, ага, обмежувальні заходи, регулювання, вплив клімату на умови торгівлі. Так, вуглець з'явився, добре, це вже добре. Захист навколишнього середовища, нетранспортабельність окремих видів продукції, концентрація виробництва. Ага, бачу в чаті зелений курс ЄС, дякую. Так, переробка відходів, перешкоди. Якщо щось втратила, вибачайте, не зачитала, але я сподіваюся, що наша наступна доповідач побачила ваші відповіді, щоб трошки зорієнтуватися, з чим в нашій аудиторії асоціюється поняття кліматичних торговельних бар'єрів. Це вже є, напевне, буде цікаво на цьому, можливо, трошки зупинитися також під час презентації, як мінімум прокоментувати. Ну і ще одне останнє маленьке запитання, перш ніж ми перейдемо до презентації. А саме наступне, наскільки, на вашу думку, в майбутньому вплив на клімат враховуватиметься у торгівельних відносинах? Та, можливо, визначатиме навіть їхній подальший розвиток. Отже, наскільки, на вашу думку, в майбутньому питання клімату враховуватиметься у торговельних відносинах та, можливо, навіть визначатиме їхній подальший розвиток? Так, тут я бачу поки такі дві ідеї між собою конкуруючі, враховуватиметься, але скоріше номінально, або в повній мірі визначатиме розвиток. Ага, мало враховується, все ж таки, хтось думає, що мало враховуватиметься. Добре, і ще є, можливо, якісь ідеї. Ну, як мінімум, ніхто не вважає, що це взагалі тут поза темою і не буде ніяк враховуватись. Це вже непогано, як на мене. Бачу, все ж таки переважна більшість з вас вважає, що це питання враховуватиметься, але скоріше номінально. Ну і далі, можливо, в повній мірі, а можливо, мало враховуватиметься, оскільки будуть більш вагомі інші чинники. Дякую, шановні колеги, дякую за участь в цьому маленькому опитуванні. І тут ми можемо далі переходити вже до нашої основної теми. Бачу, що пані Оксана так посміхається, напевно, цікаво і теж було, сподіваюсь, почути ці ідеї. Ось поділіться з нами, будь ласка, вашими думками, ну і передаємо вам далі слово.